States Air Force retired. Colonel Weaver retired from the Air Force after 22 years of active duty. He attended Stanford University and graduated from San Jose State University. In addition, he also graduated from the Industrial College of the Armed Forces. He is a command pilot with over 7,000 flying hours in a KC-97, a KC-135, and a C-123. In Vietnam, Colonel Weaver flew 444 combat missions and received the Air Medal with 23 oak leaf clusters. Upon returning from Vietnam, he was stationed at Patrick Air Force Base in Florida, where he was assigned as the station director of the Apollo Range Instrument Aircraft Control Center, which was responsible for transmitting astronaut voice and information back to the world. Doc Weaver is married to his wife of Alice for over 60 years. They have a son and 3 grandchildren. It's indeed my honor to present Colonel Weaver, who will share some thoughts with us about Donald Stewart, who he served with.
Good morning. Amy, did you say my talk was limited to 3.5 hours? Oh, I'm sorry. No, that's not. Anyway, I served in Vietnam in the 309th Air Commando Squadron in Saigon from 64 to 65. And if you remember, back in that time, that's when we were building up the forces in Vietnam. Not much activity had happened before that, really on a grand scale. If you're not familiar with the 123, it was a perfect aircraft for Vietnam. It was built in World War II. It was an old airplane that nobody wanted, and that's what we flew in because it could land in short fields. And we had over 110 airfields in Vietnam that we landed at. That was called short fields. There were 2 pilots on board, a loadmaster, of which Donald Stewart was a loadmaster, and a flight engineer on occasion, and a navigator on occasion. I flew with Donald Stewart numerous times. It was sort of unusual because what we do is we go down at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, and then we learn who our crew members were. And more as I flew, I learned that Donald liked to fly, and he must have made some changes and came and flew with me. I know many of you veterans are the same. You don't talk about a lot of the little things you did, and you sort of ignore it and move on. But I thought today with just a little bit different twist, I'll pin in and let you know some of the things that Donald and I did together. When we first got to Vietnam, there were numerous officers and enlisted that had families over there. Now here we are going to war with a family, so the family would leave breakfast table in the morning and go out and fly combat missions and then go home. Well, the Air Force, or the military decided at that time we had to change that. So we had to move all of the dependents out of Vietnam. In addition to the orphanages were all over Vietnam, so out of it came personal furniture, dogs, cats, and all kinds of things that you can realize, the people that have been over there with the missionaries. It took about 2 weeks to get that done, and then we just moved them to Saigon, and I don't know what happened to them because they brought them back to the States, and then we became a more combat-oriented outfit. If you'll remember, the initial bombings in Vietnam were conducted out of Thailand, and then SAC wanted to get involved in it, so they convinced the Pentagon that they could do the job, so they started flying into Vietnam and into South Vietnam. I remember one morning I went out to the airplane and Donald was out there loading 20,000 pounds of ammunition in the airplane. So we talked about it and we got tied down and took off, and we were heading about 45 minutes northeast of Saigon, and it looked like 4 football fields in front of us was just exploding. And it was SAC on their first mission, and they blew up all of this land. And that was just to let them know that they were there. The control center didn't tell us what this was. We had no idea. So we turned around, we went back to Saigon, and we got there, and they said, well, you're not allowed to know because this is a top secret mission. Well, we were pretty close to being in there with all that ammo. So they asked me if I would go back and take photographs of the area that was destroyed because the Pentagon wanted this. So I said, sure, I'd go back. So we all went back, and we had a cameraman from the Air Photo and Charting Service, and so he got on with his great big camera and went to the idea that he was going to take pictures. So we flew, and I got over near the end of the runway, or over the field where it was destroyed, and I called the forward air controller and I said, we're coming in. He said, we're going to get hit. I said, well, we'll try our best to avoid it. So anyway, the way to get a 123 moving is get up high altitude, like 4,000 or 5,000 feet, and dive for the end of this disaster area. So we did that. In the meantime, Donald was in the back, and he was tying a harness and a big rope onto this cameraman, and we let down the ramp and back, and then he put this cameraman there on his stomach. So he's there, and he said, we're all set. And so I went down, and I was down below the tree line, and we did start to take some fire. And the next word Donald said to me was, Captain, he says, the photographer said that he has all the photos that he needs. And so I pictured what happened was the first shot went between his hands and the camera, and the other one went between his legs. And I could look around from the front of the airplane and see, and he was up in the corner, and that was the end of it. So I asked him if he would please send me some pictures, which he never did. Moves us on to another thing here. One of the fun days we had up there was the State Department, through the embassy there, asked if we would go and visit a refugee camp that was just north of Bamitu. And the reason was that the next day, Senator Edward Kennedy and Millard Tydings were going to inspect the refugee camp. So we flew up there with some of the embassy personnel, landed, and got up there, and the embassy fellow was walking in, and he said, how many people are here in this refugee camp? And the camp commander said 20,000. And he said, how many latrines do you have? And the camp commander said, 7. And he said, oh, Senator Kennedy wouldn't like that. He said, dig 3 more. So Anyway, we used to fly it, and actually in our airplane, the whole rear end of the airplane really belonged to Donald. Because if we had prisoners, Vietnamese prisoners on board, he guaranteed our safety. And then he also got to interview all the different dignitaries that rode with us. Anybody that wanted to could ride in the 123, you just asked the pilots. So anyway, one day my boss came down and he says, Richard Clerman from Time Life magazine is going to fly with you. And he said he will be with you all day and just answer any questions he might have. So we're flying along, and he asked Don, he said, how are we doing in the war? So anyway, Don said, well, sir, he said, I think we need to do better. We're a little slow here. And he said, well, that's not what General Westmoreland told me this morning. So there's a whole different dialogue between what was going on the East Coast of the United States and our headquarters. Besides doing the day flying, we flew at night all the time too. They had, well, I don't know if Army people would be familiar with the Hamlet program, where they guard the hamlets, and we'd fly around and light them up. And I always said we lit them up so they could see where the enemy was. They said I lit it up so the enemy could see where they were. So anyway, when we got there originally in 74, we had to have a Vietnamese on board our aircraft. It was called Rules of Engagement. And so one night we were flying, and at night when you were flying and you make these circles, you could see the tracers coming up behind, but you were always ahead of them, so it wasn't that bad. But the Vietnamese navigator called me and he says, Captain, he said, I'm talking to ground. And I said, what does ground say? And he said, ground says climb, climb, climb. Well, anyway, the hardest part for me is to finish with what happened on December 11th, 1965. Got up, usual mission, flew around 5 Corps down the bottom. That's where the Army had all kinds of runways down there, but that's where they parked all their airplanes too, so it was sort of difficult to land sometimes. Anyway, we were flying around delivering anything down there. Could have been mail, could have been food, could have been ammo. And we ran out of things to do. So I said, well, let's go back to Saigon. So we went back there, and my boss, Horsky, Bob Horsky, came out, and he said, you can't fly anymore today. He says, you've flown 150 hours this month, and that's more than we allow, and I'm taking the airplane. So anyway, I said, well, okay, and he went and they took off, they went up to Pleiku, and they picked up 81 Vietnamese. We always did that, we were moving Arvin around all over the place. And then when they got finished there, they were gonna fly down to Tuiwa and drop them off. Well, the aircraft never arrived, and unfortunately, the worst thing in the world is that plane crashed. There has been no more research into exactly what the problem was, but it did strike a mountain that was about 17 miles west of Tuiwa. So that sort of explains how I'm here today. And my crew isn't, and it's been a real tough thing. And what's wonderful with me is the way I've kept in contact with Wanda and Donna, and we tried to look at this thing from a positive closing, and I'm rambling now, but I'm going to finish. And thank you all for listening to what I had to say today.